The PS1 era wasn't just a golden age, it was lightning in a bottle. Developers pushed primitive hardware beyond its limits, creating games that balanced ambition with technical wizardry. Pre-rendered backgrounds that looked like paintings, cinematic storytelling that rivaled films, and gameplay depth that modern RPGs still chase. These 14 games prove why that generation remains untouchable. MediaVision's Western-inspired RPG launched early in PS1's life cycle, yet showed what the console could achieve with creativity and strong art direction. The opening anime sequence, the whistling soundtrack, the cel-shaded 3D battles, all set a tone that made Wild Arms feel special. The game used 2D sprites for exploration on pre-rendered backgrounds, then switched to full 3D for battles. That transition was seamless, with the camera swooping from overhead exploration to dynamic combat angles without loading pauses. Each character had unique puzzle-solving tools outside combat: bombs, grappling hooks, magic that encouraged environmental interaction. Combat featured 3 playable characters with completely different fighting styles. Rudy's arms were customizable firearms. Jack wielded fast draws requiring button timing, and Cecilia cast magic with elemental effectiveness. The Guardian summons triggered FMV-quality sequences showing massive creatures devastating enemies. This was special for the atmosphere. The Wild West aesthetic, dusty towns, frontier settlements, ancient ruins, all rendered with a painterly quality that made exploration feel like traveling through a storybook. Combined with the whistling soundtrack, every location had personality. The puzzle dungeons required spatial thinking and tool usage that most PS1 RPGs avoided. Pushing blocks, bombing walls, grappling across gaps, all tracked with physics calculations that added complexity. Where Wild Arms proved PS1's potential was in strong art direction could make technical limitations invisible. It wasn't the most powerful game on the console, but remains memorable because of creative vision. Square took everything they learned from PS1 development and created a visual masterpiece that still looks gorgeous today. The color palette alone set it apart. Vibrant tropical blues, golden sunsets, lush greens, in an era when most games leaned gray and brown. Every environment felt painted rather than rendered. El Nido's beaches shimmered with realistic water effects. Coral reefs underwater glowed with bioluminescence, and the parallel dimension twisted familiar locations into eerie, corrupted versions. The pre-rendered backgrounds hid PS1's rough edges while creating cohesive visual illusions that felt impossible for the hardware. Battle animations were spectacular. Summons filled screens with explosions of light and abstract geometry that felt closer to modern CGI than 32-bit graphics. Elemental attacks cascaded with particle effects. Characters moved with fluid animation, and the field effects system changed battlefield colors dynamically based on elemental usage. What impressed me technically was the seamless transitions, moving between areas, entering battles, triggering cutscenes. All happened without loading pauses or jarring shifts. The game maintained flow that kept you immersed in its world. The massive character roster, over 40 playable characters, each required unique models, combat animations, and dialogue variations. Managing that amount of character data while maintaining visual fidelity showed serious optimization. Where Chrono Cross succeeded brilliantly is in using color and tone to create atmosphere. Combined with Yasunori Mitsuda's legendary soundtrack blending flutes, strings, and percussion perfectly with the visuals, it became a complete sensory experience. Every frame looks like a watercolor painting come alive. Tri-Ace created what many consider the most visually stunning sprite-based RPG on PS1. Gorgeous 2D character art layered over 3D environments, with lighting and particle effects that made every frame look like a moving painting. The combat system was revolutionary. You controlled 4 characters simultaneously, each mapped to a face button. Press them in rhythm, and your team unleashed coordinated attacks, launching enemies into the air and juggling them with timed inputs. Special moves triggered cinematic super attacks with camera cuts, slow-motion effects, and explosive particle bursts. What made this technically impressive was the dual-world structure. You explored a 2D side-scrolling map with platforming mechanics, while battles took place on 3D planes with dynamic camera work. The game constantly switched between rendering modes seamlessly, maintaining visual clarity throughout. The Einherjar system tracked dozens of fallen warriors you recruited, each with full backstories told through vignettes. The game rendered these emotional character moments with hand-drawn art and voice acting, then transitioned to combat where those same characters had unique move sets and combination attacks. The time management added complexity. Every action consumed time segments, affecting which dungeons you could visit and which Einherjar became available. The game tracked multiple story branches, character relationship values, and endings based on decisions made across the entire playthrough. But it also showed PS1's limits when some areas suffered slight slowdown during particularly chaotic multi-hit combos. But the visual style, that blend of 2D artistry and 3D effects, remains timeless even today. Triace Space Opera RPG was absurdly ambitious for 1998. Real-time combat, over 80 different endings, a massive item creation system, and dual protagonist paths that completely changed how the story played out. The combat system ran smoothly despite complexity. You controlled one character in real time, while AI managed others, all tracking MP costs, skill cooldowns, positioning, and enemy patterns simultaneously. Special attacks triggered cinematic camera cuts without loading pauses, and battles maintained frame rates even when particle effects filled screens. What made this technically impressive was the private action system. In every town, your party split up, and you could trigger unique scenes based on who you'd recruited and relationship values tracked throughout the playthrough. These scenes affected the ending, with over 80 variations based on character combinations and choices. The item creation system was ridiculously deep. Synthesis, authoring, cooking, crafting, all with probability calculations and skill checks. The game maintained databases tracking thousands of potential item combinations and your progress across dozens of creation categories. The skill system let characters learn abilities through use and teaching. Voice acting, orchestra, art, skills affected gameplay, and unlocked new possibilities and talents. Managing skill points, proficiency levels, and character relationships created progression depth most RPGs didn't attempt. The sheer amount of content pushed boundaries. Multiple story paths, hundreds of recruitable characters, endless item combinations, and replayability that justified dozens of playthroughs. Star Ocean proved PS1 could handle action RPG complexity at a scale that felt impossible. Square merged survival horror with RPG mechanics and called it a cinematic RPG, and they meant it literally. This game used movie-style editing, camera angles, and lighting to tell its story about biological horror spreading through New York City. The technical achievement was atmosphere. Pre-rendered backgrounds showed realistic city environments, snow-dusted Central Park, Times Square at night, the glittering skyline reflected in wet pavement. Square's lighting work created mood through shadow and color in ways PS1 hardware shouldn't have managed. Every location felt cold, isolated, dangerous. Combat was semi-real time with an active time bar, but battles played out in the same environments you explored. No transitions, no loading. Enemies appeared organically and fights initiated seamlessly. The camera swooped cinematically while maintaining player control, and Aya's movement felt responsive despite cinematic framing. The mutation effects on enemies were grotesque and detailed. Creatures transformed mid-battle, flesh contorting and changing in real-time animations that push the console's polygon limits. Spell effects, healing, attack magic, biological mutations, all rendered with particle systems and lighting changes that added visual chaos without destroying performance. What made this special was production value that rivaled films. FMV cutscenes were spectacular, showing the Opera House Massacre and creature transformations with CGI quality that stood alongside big-budget animation. The electronic soundtrack by Yoko Shimomura played constantly without compression issues, using pre-rendered backgrounds to create photorealistic environments while reserving processing power for real-time combat and effects might have set an example. Konami's masterpiece packed over 100 recruitable characters, massive army battles, strategic war scenarios, and one of the most emotionally devastating stories on PS1. All running on sprite-based graphics that held more personality than most 3D games managed. The technical achievement was the scope. Over 100 unique characters, each with their own backstory, portrait art, combat abilities, and roles in your castle headquarters. The game tracked relationships between characters, triggering unique dialogue and team-up attacks based on who you recruited. Managing that amount of character data and interaction combinations on PS1 memory was absurd. Army battles used an entirely separate RTS-style strategic system where you commanded units across battlefields. One-on-one duels added another layer with their own mechanics. The game seamlessly transitioned between traditional party combat, war scenarios, and duels without loading screens or performance drops. What impressed me was the attention to detail in your castle headquarters. As you recruited more characters, the castle grew organically. New shops opened, bathhouses appeared, libraries expanded. NPCs moved around based on time of day, and certain characters only appeared if you'd recruited their friends. The world felt reactive in ways most PS1 RPGs didn't attempt. The emotional storytelling hit harder because of technical restraint. Sprites couldn't show subtle expressions, so Konami used positioning, music, and dialogue timing to convey grief and betrayal. The childhood friend who becomes your enemy. That relationship built through hundreds of small interactions tracked by the game's relationship system. The brilliant thing was them accepting sprite limitations and using them to create a scale 3D couldn't match at the time. Before Shadow Hearts refined the formula, Delca was experimenting with gothic horror RPG design that felt completely unique. Saknith created an atmospheric survival horror experience using cinematic presentation that pushed PS1 capabilities hard. Set in 1898 Wales investigating a haunted monastery, the game used pre-rendered backgrounds with oppressive lighting and detailed environmental storytelling. Every room felt handcrafted with furniture, religious iconography, and decay rendered with attention that made exploration tense. The camera angles were fixed like Resident Evil, creating compositions that felt deliberately framed. Combat unfolded on small, grid-based battlefields with turn-based tactics. The pacing was slow and methodical, matching the horror tone perfectly. Every encounter felt dangerous because resource management mattered and healing items stayed scarce throughout. What set this apart, technically, was full voice acting for every line of dialogue. The performances were theatrical and mature, treating the gothic horror premise seriously. Combined with motion-captured character animations and cinematic cutscenes, it felt more like an interactive dark fantasy film than a typical RPG. The soundtrack was hauntingly beautiful. Minimalist piano, eerie strings, and melancholic silence that lingered after battles. Sound design built tension through echoing footsteps, distant whispers, and environmental noises that made every corridor feel inhabited by something malevolent. But it struggled with slow pacing and clunky combat turned many players away. But Delca earned respect for committing fully to its vision, creating an oppressive gothic atmosphere few PS1 games attempted. Square's mech tactics RPG packed depth that strategy game enthusiasts still reference. Turn-based combat on grid maps with customizable mechs, branching storylines, and simulation complexity that shouldn't have fit on PS1 hardware. The technical achievement was mech customization. You built Wanzers from scratch, choosing body parts, weapons, computers, backpacks, with hundreds of combinations affecting stats, abilities, and battle performance. The game rendered these custom mechs in combat with unique attack animations and damage models showing wear and destruction. Combat animations were spectacular. Mechs fired missiles, swung pile bunkers, launched grenades, and triggered melee attacks with cinematic camera cuts. Each weapon type had distinct visual effects, and the game tracked ammo counts, part durability, and pilot stats simultaneously. The dual storyline structure was ambitious. Emma and Elisa routes told completely different narratives covering the same global conflict from opposing perspectives. Each path had unique missions, characters, and plot revelations. The amount of branching content stored on one disc was staggering. The network feature added meta progression. Hacking into simulated internet terminals unlocked side missions, character backstories, and world lore. This secondary content rivaled the main campaign in scope, all tracked separately from your primary save data. Front Mission 3 proved the PS1's power by handling complex simulation systems while maintaining tactical depth and visual spectacle. Modern mech games still chase this level of customization and strategic complexity. Sony's answer to Final Fantasy was a 4-disc technical showcase designed to prove the PS1 could still compete as the generation ended. Massive pre-render environments, enormous battle models, and FMV cutscenes that rivaled anything Square produced. The addition system made every attack interactive. Timed button presses triggered combo chains with unique animations for each character and difficulty levels. Perfect execution felt satisfying because the visual feedback, sparks, trails, impact effects, all rendered smoothly despite technical demands. Dragoon transformations were spectacular. Characters morphed mid-battle into armored warriors with completely different models, move sets, and particle effects. The transformation sequences used FMV quality visuals, triggering in real time without loading pauses. Each Dragoon had unique magic attacks with cinematic camera work and elemental explosions. What impressed me was environmental variety. From Helena Prison to the Divine Tree to Deningrad's snowy peaks. Each location had distinct visual identity with detailed textures and atmospheric effects. The game jumped between these settings while maintaining visual consistency. Boss battles were cinematic showcases. Multi-phase fights with transforming enemies, environmental destruction, and set pieces that dynamically changed battle arenas. The final boss sequence alone probably used more FMV than some entire PS1 games. The scope of the game makes it obvious how ambitious they were. 4 discs of content, dozens of unique Dragoon forms, hundreds of enemy types each with detailed models. Legend of Dragoon proved PS1 could deliver technical spectacle that competed with early PS2 titles. While other PS1 RPGs chased cinematic spectacle, tactics focused on mechanical depth that modern strategy games still reference. The job system offered 20-plus classes with hundreds of ability combinations, creating build variety that felt endless. The technical achievement was how much data the game tracked simultaneously. Every character had equipment, job levels, learned abilities, stat growth, and zodiac compatibility affecting damage calculations. Battles featured elevation-based positioning, charge times for spells and abilities, status effects stacking in complex ways, and AI routines that actually required tactical thinking. Isometric battlefields used pre-rendered terrain with 3D character sprites moving across them. The camera could rotate to show different angles, and attack animations changed based on positioning and weapon types. Spell effects like Holy and Flare filled screens with particle explosions despite hardware that struggled with transparency effects. The writing was darker and more politically complex than most PS1 RPGs dared attempt. Betrayals, class warfare, religious corruption, all told through text-heavy dialogue. The game stored alongside combat data. The amount of branching dialogue and character interactions should have overwhelmed memory constraints. It somehow made complexity feel manageable. The learning curve was steep, but systems interacted logically. Experimenting with job combinations felt rewarding rather than overwhelming because the game trusted players to figure things out. The depth here, both mechanical and narrative, proved PS1 could handle strategy RPG complexity that consoles supposedly couldn't manage until later generations. The game that proved JRPGs could be mainstream blockbusters also proved PS1 could handle technical ambition that seemed impossible. 3 discs packed with content, pre-rendered backgrounds that looked photorealistic, and FMV sequences that rivaled film CGI. Midgar's industrial sprawl was rendered with astonishing detail. Mako reactors, slum sectors, Shinra headquarters, all built from pre-rendered backgrounds with lighting and perspective that created genuine depth. The plate structure showed scale through clever camera work and environmental design that made you feel tiny in a massive dystopian city. The materia system required tracking hundreds of combinations affecting stats, abilities, and character growth. Limit breaks triggered cinematic attacks with unique animations for each character. Summon sequences were legendary. Knights of the Round, Bahamut Zero, filling screens with FMV quality effects that made battles feel like boss encounters. What made this groundbreaking was production scale. Full orchestrated soundtrack, hours of FMV cutscenes, voice samples during combat, and a world map that spanned an entire planet. The Golden Saucer alone was essentially multiple mini-games with separate mechanics and graphics. The story scope was massive. Time-traveling flashbacks, ecological themes, identity crises, corporate corruption, all told through text-heavy dialogue backed by expressive character models. Cloud's psychological breakdown was conveyed through visual distortion and music cues that showed technical creativity. FF7 succeeded in proving the PS1 could deliver cinematic experiences that competed with any medium. It wasn't just technically impressive, it changed what people expected from video game storytelling. Few PS1 games squeezed as much technical power from the console as Vagrant's story did in 2000. Square created real-time lighting, fully 3D environments, and cinematic camera work that felt like it belonged on the PS2. There are no loading screens once you enter Liamond. The entire game is one continuous, interconnected dungeon. The lighting system was revolutionary. Torches flickered against stone walls. Moonlight poured through broken stained glass. Shadows moved dynamically as you explored. Square used advanced texture compression and lighting tricks to create volumetric depth that shouldn't have been possible. Every corridor felt purposefully lit, every shadow intentional. Character animations used motion capture, giving Ashley Riot a weight and fluidity rare for the time. The cinematic direction, seamless camera pans, dramatic close-ups, expressive gestures, made cutscenes feel like directed films rather than game graphics. Combat animations were sharp and deliberate, with different weapon types having unique move sets and impacts. What made this technically astounding was the weapon crafting system running underneath. You're not just swapping gear, you're combining blades, hilts, grips, and gems with the game, tracking elemental affinities, damage types, and enemy resistances for hundreds of potential combinations. The amount of data juggled simultaneously while maintaining visual fidelity was absurd. The risk system added another layer. Every combo attack raised your gauge, affecting accuracy and damage in real-time calculations. Targeting specific body parts required hit detection precision that PS1 games rarely attempted. It showed its limits when some areas suffered frame rate dips, and the complexity occasionally overwhelmed the hardware. But what Square achieved here proved the console could handle next-generation ambitions if developers pushed hard enough. Square's swan song for the PS1 was a technical masterpiece disguised as a fairy tale. They built this game knowing it would be remastered someday, designing assets at resolutions the console couldn't natively display. The original backgrounds were rendered at 720p before being compressed down to 240p for the PS1's memory limitations. Every environment felt hand-painted because it essentially was. The pre-rendered backdrops, Alexandria's cobblestone streets, Lineblum's industrial clockwork, the mist-covered plains, all carried this painterly quality that made exploration feel like walking through living artwork. Character models were small by necessity, but their animations were so expressive that Vivi's existential dread and Zidane's cocky swagger came through perfectly. What struck me most was how seamless the transitions were. Cutscenes blended into gameplay so smoothly you couldn't tell where FMV ended and real-time rendering began. The active time event system let you see multiple character perspectives simultaneously, requiring the game to render separate scenes happening in parallel. The PS1 wasn't built for that level of complexity. Combat animations were spectacular despite hardware limits. Summon sequences like Bahamut and Alexander filled the screen with particle effects and cinematic camera work that felt impossible for 32-bit hardware. The voice acting during summons, the orchestrated soundtrack playing without compression artifacts, all of it pushed boundaries. Where it showed brilliance was accepting limitations creatively. By using pre-rendered backgrounds, Square could craft scenes with lighting and detail that full 3D could match. The art direction made those limitations invisible. Square built something too ambitious for PS1 hardware, and the second disc proved it. But what they achieved in the first disc, and the sheer audacity of the attempt, makes Xenogears legendary. The game blended 2D character sprites with fully 3D environments and mech battles seamlessly. Characters moved through rendered towns and dungeons with cinematic camera angles sweeping overhead. Then you'd climb into a gear, a massive mech, and the perspective shifted entirely, with scale changes that made environments feel genuinely enormous. Gear battles required completely different rendering pipelines. These towering machines fought with explosive special attacks, transformation sequences, and cinematic finishing moves that pushed the PS1's particle system past reasonable limits. The game stored data for dozens of unique gears, each with independent progression trees and customization options. What made this technically ambitious was the storytelling scope. The narrative spanned generations, involving ancient civilizations, lost technology, religious manipulation, and existential philosophy. Cutscenes were lengthy, fully voiced in Japanese, with real-time character models framed with film-quality direction. The amount of dialogue and scene data stored on those 2 discs was staggering. The platforming segments mixed 2D character movement with 3D spatial puzzles. Jumping between platforms while the camera rotated dynamically created depth perception challenges the console wasn't designed to handle smoothly. But the infamous second disc shift to narration over static images illustrated their limits. Square ran out of time and money trying to fit everything on a PS1 hardware. But even that failure showed how impossibly ambitious Xenogears was, a game that literally couldn't be contained by its platform.